Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar about clinical evidence for medical devices under Regulation 2017-745. The webinar will be recorded and all participants are muted. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature or write me an email. As it is hard to coordinate all upcoming questions during the webinar, I will answer them individually afterwards. Also, the slides of this presentation were prepared to serve as a guide and will be made available to you. My name is Kivia Pontes de Oliveira, and I am a consultant for clinical affairs at ProSystem, an NSF International company. I have several years of professional experience in the fields of medical writing and clinical affairs. In the last years, I have evaluated clinical data and prepared clinical evaluations following the new clinical requirements for medical devices of Class 1 to Class 3. During the webinar today, I will summarize the requirements of the regulation regarding the evaluation and generation of clinical data. Briefly, during the webinar, I will give you a short introduction on the regulation and the definition of clinical data, go through the general requirements on clinical data, and discuss potential routes to perform a clinical evaluation. I will also indicate how to identify and generate clinical data and give an overview of the documentation of clinical data in interface with post-market surveillance. At the end, I will talk about some strategical steps on how you can start preparing to become compliant with the regulation. First of all, to understand the European regulatory framework for medical devices, I would like to clarify the difference between a directive and a regulation. Basically, a directive needs to be transferred into the national law of each country to become official, while in the case of a regulation, all requirements are directly legally binding in the whole European Union. The Medical Device Directive and the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive are currently still in place. On the 25th of May 2017, the regulation came into force with a transition period of 3 years, which means that it will become effective on the 26th of May 2020. If you have any questions regarding particular transitional timeframes related to manufacturer obligations, device registration, and validity of certificates, you might want to check out the Article 120 of the regulation. The European Union also has a number of medical device guidelines. One example is the Guideline on Clinical Evaluations, MEDEV 271, Revision 4, which refers to the current directives. With the regulation in place, guidelines referred to the directives are officially repealed. Therefore, a new revision of this guideline and/or additional guidelines of the European Commission is needed for further guidance on clinical evaluation. The requirements on clinical evaluation from the regulation is consistent with the recommendations from the MEDEV guideline. We could even say that this guideline can be considered complementary to the regulation, in the sense that it offers practical guidance on how to fulfill some of its requirements. So you might consider to still adopt the MEDEV guideline in your own internal process as an orientation to prepare clinical evaluations. Why did the European Union prepare a regulation? After scandals affecting the medical device industry, the regulation was developed to improve human health and safety of medical devices. Significant reinforcements were made in areas such as supervision of notified bodies, conformity assessment procedures, conduction of clinical evaluations and clinical investigations, as well as vigilance and market surveillance. Furthermore, it is intended that medical device issues are soon recognized and that the authorities can trace a medical device from its production to its distribution. The final aim is to have a solid, transparent, predictable, and sustainable regulatory framework that nevertheless promotes innovation. When we compare the numbers of articles and annexes in the Medical Device Directive with the ones in the regulation, we can see that they have greatly increased. The regulation has in total 123 articles and 17 annexes, from which to a large extent deals with requirements on clinical data. Here I have listed the most important ones. Article 61, which deals with clinical evaluation, Articles 62 to 82, and Annex 15, which addresses clinical investigations, and Annex 14, which focus on clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up. We won't discuss all of them in detail, but I will always indicate in the next slides where the information comes from. The Article 61 of the regulation defines clinical evaluation. The aims of the clinical evaluation are to confirm the conformity of a medical device with relevant general safety and performance requirements, as well as to evaluate the undesirable side effects and the acceptability of benefit-risk ratio. A clinical evaluation has to be based on clinical data, and this data should provide sufficient clinical evidence, including, when applicable, data from the post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. Finally, a clinical evaluation has to be planned, conducted, and documented. Further instructions on how to proceed can be found in Article 61 and Part A of Annex 14. To better understand this definition, we need to explore the meanings of clinical data and clinical evidence. So, what are clinical data? Let's go to Article 2, the definitions. Clinical data are data coming from clinical investigations of the device under evaluation, clinical investigations or other studies performed using equivalent devices, reports on other clinical experience of either the device under evaluation or its equivalent device, and clinically relevant information coming from post-market surveillance, in particular the post-market clinical follow-up. Here I would like to highlight that post-market clinical follow-up is not a new concept, but it was not mentioned as part of the definition of clinical data in the Medical Device Directive. To better understand the last part of the definition of clinical data, we need to go to the definition of post-market surveillance. Manufacturers are required to implement a post-market surveillance system to collect and review experience data from devices placed on the market. A post-market surveillance system should also include post-market clinical follow-up activities, PMCF, which is a continuous process to proactively collect clinical data. Therefore, the definition of clinical data in the regulation makes it clear that experience gained from devices on the market are a source of clinical evidence on safety and performance. The regulation also defines the term clinical evidence, which means clinical data and clinical evaluation results pertaining to a device of a sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefits. This definition brings us to another question. What is sufficient clinical evidence? To help clarify this term, we can consult the MEDEV guideline. There, we read that amounts and quality of data are important criteria that should be taken into account to define sufficient. Let's go a little bit deeper into these definitions. By amount of data, we can understand how many aspects of the medical device are covered by the data. Is there data showing that the device can be successfully used for its purpose and indications? Has the device been used for the intended target group? Does it do what has been claimed? Is it safe? Is it still one of the best technologies on the market, at least for certain indications? By quality, we can ask ourselves if we can trust the data, their analysis, and their source. Which types of investigations have been performed? For published data, what was the study design? What was the level of evidence of the study? Were the statistical analysis and its conclusions correct? Did the study follow ethical and legal aspects? And so on. In the end, the manufacturer has to specify and justify the level of clinical evidence necessary to demonstrate conformity of its device with the relevant general safety and performance requirements. The notified body will then evaluate the data and the manufacturer's justification. Let's now talk about the requirements on clinical evaluation and the routes that can be adopted to conduct it. So, when should a manufacturer start considering clinical data? Basically, since the initial discussions about the product idea. At this point, it is recommended to do a preclinical evaluation, which includes a clinical evaluation plan and a clinical evaluation report. Some questions should be asked. Is this technology new? Is there a predecessor or equivalent device in the market? Are there data showing that these devices are safe and perform well? Are there other alternatives for the same indications being used currently? Which are the advantages and disadvantages of my device? During the product development, it is the time to perform tests to acquire preclinical data showing the performance and safety of the device. In the case of implantable Class 3 devices, as well as Class 1 and 2 devices, for which there is not sufficient clinical data available, it is the moment to perform clinical investigations. Before the registration of the device, the clinical evaluation plan should be updated, if necessary, and a clinical evaluation report should be released. Finally, after the product approval, the manufacturer should have a post-market surveillance system in place, including post-market clinical follow-up activities. This data should then be used to prepare and update the post-market clinical evaluation plan and reports. Before proceeding to the potential routes to perform a clinical evaluation, you should also consider the following special cases. The clinical evaluation of products without an intended medical purpose, such as contact lenses and dermal fillers, shall be based on relevant data concerning safety, which includes data from post-market surveillance, PMCF, and, if sufficient clinical data is not available, specific clinical investigation. In these cases, the demonstration of clinical benefits should be understood as a demonstration of performance. There are also products, such as sterilization trays, for which the demonstration of conformity based on clinical data is not considered appropriate. In such cases, the manufacturer should present an adequate justification based on the results of risk management, considerations about the interaction between the device and the human body, the clinical performance intended, and the claims of the manufacturer. Basically, the manufacturer will have to demonstrate conformity, mostly based on the technical documentation. Importantly, according to the MEDEV guideline, a clinical evaluation report, including a literature search, is still expected. Its strategy should then be adapted accordingly. After considering the categories of medical devices for which more specific types of clinical evaluations are required, we will now look at the criteria to choose between the equivalence routes and the clinical investigation routes. If you would like to follow the equivalence route, meaning to adopt an equivalent device, the first question you need to ask is if you have access to sufficient clinical data to show the safety and performance of your device. To make this decision, think about the following points. Which is the class of your device? For a class 1 device, the amount of data to show clinical evidence will be much less than for a class 3 device. Is the technology in which my device is based new? If so, you might need to generate further clinical data. Is there an equivalent device in the market? Is there clinical data available from this device? When I perform literature research, are there studies in which either my device or an equivalent device has been used? Has my product already been for a long time on the market, and could I collect clinical experience data? You should also make sure that a clinical investigation is not mandatory to your device. For class 3 devices, clinical investigations should always be performed, except if the device has been designed by modifications of a device already marketed by the same manufacturer, the modified device has been demonstrated by the manufacturer to be equivalent to a market device, and the clinical evaluation of the market device is sufficient to demonstrate conformity of the modified device with the relevant safety and performance requirements. In this case, the notified body will check if the PMCF plan is appropriate and includes market studies to demonstrate the safety and performance of the device. In paragraph 6, it is also stated that the requirement to perform clinical investigations does not apply to implantable devices and class 3 devices which have been lawfully placed on the market and put into service in accordance with the directives, as well as if they belong to product types such as sutures, staples, dental fillings, dental braces, tooth crowns, screws, wedges, plates, wires, pins, clips, or connectors. However, only if the clinical evaluation is based on sufficient clinical data and is in compliance with the relevant product-specific common specification. If the equivalence route is an alternative for your clinical evaluation, you should take into account the requirements stated in paragraph 5 of Article 61. In case of an equivalent device, which is manufactured by another company, the two manufacturers shall have a contract in place that explicitly allows the manufacturer of the second device full access to the technical documentation. Here, it's important to consider that a contract between two potential competitors to allow access to the technical documentation of the devices is very unlikely to be prepared. However, be aware that it is not clear whether the regulation in this paragraph refers only to class 3 devices and implantable devices, or also to other classes of devices. After considering the previous explanations, it is now the time to evaluate if an equivalence route is indeed an option. Let's have a look at the requirements to demonstrate the equivalence of a device. According to Annex 14, Part 1 of the regulation, Part 8 of the regulation, equivalent devices should share clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. Basically, most clinical and biological characteristics should be the same, and most technical characteristics should be at least similar. The MEDEF guideline also states that equivalence should be based on clinical, technical, and biological characteristics. Equivalent devices should be used to treat the same clinical condition, have the same intended purpose, be used for the same site in the body, be used under the same conditions, and be made of the same materials. In addition, Equivalence should be demonstrated based on evidence. In summary, an equivalent device can be a predecessor device or a medical device from another manufacturer. But their technical characteristics have to be similar to the extent that there would be no clinically significant difference in the safety and clinical performance of the device. Considerations of equivalence also have to be based on proper scientific justification. Last but not least, the manufacturer should have sufficient level of access to the data related to the devices with which they are claiming equivalence. For that, a document showing an agreement between the manufacturers might have to be prepared. If sufficient data for the device under evaluation is not available and equivalence cannot be claimed, a clinical investigation will be necessary. To perform a clinical investigation, keep in mind that claims and clinical risks of the device should be taken into account when preparing the study protocol. In addition, not only the regulation, but also standard ISO 14155, the Declaration of Helsinki, and specific requirements of the member states of the EU have to be followed. You should also become familiar with further information on EUDAMED, the electronic system on clinical investigation in the European Union, and on single submission. Regarding the requirements on clinical investigation, I also would like to emphasize that they went from approximately 2 pages in the MDD to approximately 20 pages in the regulation, which include information found in 20 articles and 1 annex. Unfortunately, we do not have time to explore these topics in depth during this webinar, but I have indicated the respective articles and annex here for further reading. After talking about the routes that can be used to show safety and performance of a device in a clinical evaluation, I would like to further explore the identification of clinical data. As I previously mentioned, the regulation states that clinical evaluation should be planned, conducted, and documented by the manufacturer. The steps for the preparation of a clinical evaluation are covered in Annex 14. However, not all the detailed steps are described there. In this sense, until a revised version of the MEDEV 271 Revision 4 is prepared, or other guidelines are published, you might consider to adopt in your internal process the recommendations found in this guideline. Regarding the identification of clinical data in Annex 14, it is stated that available clinical data to cover the intended purpose of the device, as well as any gaps in clinical evidence, can be identified through a systematic scientific literature review. In addition, it is made clear that the clinical evaluation should be thorough and objective, and take into account both favorable and unfavorable data. The clinical data should also be appropriate to the nature, classification, intended purpose, and risks of the device in question, as well as cover the manufacturer's claims. In Chapter 8 of the MEDEV guideline, sources of pertinent data are listed and include data from the manufacturer, such as clinical investigations, PMCF studies, PMS reports, incident reports, complaints regarding performance and safety, details of all field safety corrective actions, among others. Sources of pertinent data also include data from the literature. This data can be related to either the device under evaluation or to the equivalent device. To obtain this data, a thorough, objective, and reproducible search strategy needs to be developed. Following this strategy, a search protocol should be prepared. Topics such as state-of-the-art and claims should also be considered. Regarding the state-of-the-art, you should think about medical alternatives in the market for the same indications covered by your device. Applicable standards, guidance documents from medical societies, critical components, the specific patient population for which the device is intended. The MEDEV guideline also emphasizes that both favorable and unfavorable data should be considered. Also, keep in mind that the term medical alternative is mentioned in the regulation as available alternative treatment options. Regarding claims, it's important to highlight that the Article 7 of the regulation explicitly says that it is prohibited to use text, names, trademarks, pictures, or figurative or other signs that may mislead the user or the patient with regard to the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance. So be sure to screen the marketing claims of your device, including web pages and marketing brochures, for clinical claims that need to be covered by clinical data. Clinical claims should also be included in your literature search protocol. Remember that all clinical claims have to be substantiated with clinical evidence. After talking about the identification of clinical data, I would like to give you an overview of the documentation of clinical data in interface with post-market surveillance. Not long ago, the term clinical evaluation would be associated only with the preparation of a clinical evaluation report. However, we should keep in mind that the preparation of a clinical evaluation report involves a continuous process to acquire and evaluate clinical data. This data should then be documented not only in the clinical evaluation report, but also in a number of other documents, the requirement and update of which differ accordingly to the medical device classes. In the next slides, I will go through the requirements for the preparation of these documents. As previously mentioned, a clinical evaluation report is mandatory for all classes of medical devices. But before preparing a clinical evaluation report, a clinical evaluation plan should be released. A clinical evaluation plan should include an identification of the general safety and performance requirements that require support from relevant clinical data, a specification of the intended purpose of the device, a specification of the intended target groups, a detailed description of intended clinical benefits to patients, a specification of methods to be used for examination of qualitative and quantitative aspects of clinical safety, a specification of parameters to be used to determine acceptability of benefit-risk ratio for indications and intended purpose of the device, an indication of how benefits risk issues relating to specific components will be addressed. And importantly, it should also include a clinical development plan. A clinical development plan should indicate the progression from exploratory investigations, such as first-in-man studies, feasibility and pilot studies, confirmatory investigations, such as pivotal clinical investigations and planned PMCF activities, with the indication of milestones and potential acceptance criteria. Following the clinical evaluation plan, a clinical evaluation report should be prepared. The evaluation states that a clinical evaluation report should document the results and the clinical evidence assessed during the clinical evaluation. In addition, a clinical evaluation report is considered a part of the technical documentation. Regarding the updates of the clinical evaluation reports, In the case of class 3 and implantable devices, it should be updated annually to address the data of the PMCF reports. The clinical evaluation report of all other device classes shall be updated every 2 to 5 years. As we previously discussed, manufacturers of all classes of medical devices are required to implement a post-market surveillance system to collect and review experience data from devices placed on the market. For that, a post-market surveillance plan should be prepared and include important aspects such as how the data will be collected and assessed, investigation of complaints, protocol for communication, recording of serious and non-serious incidents, information on training reports, searches in the literature, databases, and registers, including similar devices, and a continuous reassessment of the benefit-risk analysis. Data collected following the post-market surveillance plan are potentially important clinical data to be considered in the clinical evaluation. The post-market surveillance plan should also address post-market clinical follow-up activities. Post-market clinical follow-up activities, or post-PMCF, is a continuous process to proactively collect and evaluate clinical data throughout the expected lifetime of the device, such as the performance of literature search or user surveys. Importantly, PMCF activities have to be performed according to documented methods laid down in the PMCF plan, which can be a part of the post-market surveillance plan. The PMCF data collected and analyzed should then update the clinical evaluation reports. The results and conclusions from the post-market surveillance data gathered have to be documented in different types of reports, depending on the class of the medical device. In the case of Class 1 devices, a PMS report should be prepared, in which results and conclusions, as well as preventive and corrective actions, are described. The PMS report is also part of the technical documentation, should be updated when necessary, and made available upon request. Manufacturers of Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3 devices have to prepare a periodic safety update report, known as PSUR, to summarize the analysis of the post-market surveillance data. The PSUR should include the conclusion of the benefit-risk determination, the main findings of the PMCF, the volume of sales of the device, and an estimated evaluation of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device. It is part of the technical documentation and should be periodically updated. The PSUR should be made available to the notified body, and in the case of Class 3 and implantable devices, it should be submitted by the electronic system called UDAMED. Finally, implantable devices and Class 3 devices should also present a summary of safety and clinical performance, which should include the identification of the device and the manufacturer, the intended purpose, indications, contraindications, and target populations, a description of the device, informing if there are previous generations or variants, and accessories, and other devices used in combination, as well as possible diagnostic or therapeutic alternatives. It should also include harmonized standards and common specifications, information on profile and training for users, residual risks, undesirable effects, warnings, precautions, and importantly, also a summary of the clinical evaluation and relevant information on post-market clinical follow-up. The summary of safety and clinical performance shall be made available via Udemy and should be updated annually. To summarize, the documentation of clinical data involves not only the clinical evaluation report, but also the documents related to post-market surveillance. Briefly, the main communicating element in this process are the post-market clinical follow-up activities. During the preparation of a PMS plan, PMCF activities should be described. These activities should also be considered in the clinical development plan, which is part of the clinical evaluation plan. The results and conclusions of the PMCF activities should be part of the clinical evaluation reports, which in return is also an input to the update of the PMCF plan. Finally, PMS and PMCF activities should also be considered in the PMS reports, in the periodic safety update reports, and in the summary of the safety and clinical performance. The summary of safety and clinical performance should also include a summary of the clinical evaluation. We are now coming to the end of our webinar, and before I leave, I would like to share some insights on how to perform the transition and fill in the gaps to become compliant with the regulation. The good news is that if your device is already compliant with the MEDEV guideline, you are in a good path. It means that you have already considered the technology of your device in relation to the current state of the art and medical alternatives. You have also already identified clinical data to provide sufficient clinical evidence for your device. So now it is the time to reevaluate the clinical data available by performing a gap analysis. Ask yourself the questions: does my device have an equivalent device? Does the equivalence still apply? How long has the device been on the market? Are there enough clinical data from clinical experience? Is there a PMCF plan in place for the lifetime of the device? If so, should it be updated? If there is no longer sufficient clinical data, should I conduct PMCF studies? Also, do not forget to update your SOPs and templates accordingly. If you have previously used clinical data from an equivalent device which no longer fulfills the regulation requirements of equivalence, or if your device has been for a long time on the market, but there are not enough clinical data available, or for other reasons you have determined that further clinical data is required for the registration of your device under the regulation, you might consider to collect clinical data now, during the transition periods, with your current CE market device. Potential sources of new clinical data are prospective or retrospective studies, including registries and the hospital information system, as well as the performance of user surveys and new literature searches. When compared to clinical investigations, PMCF activities are a cost-effective way to acquire clinical data and show clinical evidence for your device. In the end, there might be no need for an equivalent device. We now reach the final slide of this webinar, and I guess that there are a lot of information which needs to be processed. As I mentioned in the beginning, I will answer all your questions via emails. Also, please do not hesitate to contact me if there are any upcoming questions after the webinar. Next week, I will be attending the trade show Hospitalar in São Paulo. If you will be there as well, feel free to contact me, and we can organize a meeting to discuss your questions personally. Thank you again for joining today.